Hello, everyone. Welcome to day 6 of the Brothers War spoilers. So today we got a lot fewer cards than yesterday, but we've got a bunch of cards, so let's get right into it. But before we do, I want to thank our sponsor, Caffeinated Gamers, for sponsoring this video. And please remember to like and subscribe to our content so you can get more Brothers War spoilers as the season progresses. So let's get started at looking at the white cards that we got today from the Brothers War. So first we have Ambush Paratrooper. For a colorless and a white mana, you get a human soldier with flash and flying. Flash and flying are a nice combination of abilities, particularly for a soldier in this situation. I think this is something that the soldier deck will want to consider as a 1 or a 2 of, just to give it some evasion in that deck. And it's a 1/2, so it's got a little bit of sustainability in itself as well. And for 5 mana, creatures you control can get +1/+1 until the end of turn. So getting this in the mid to late game, it's got the advantage of being able to cast it and then pump your team up as well. Second card we got today is a Great Desert Prospector. For 4 colorless and a white mana, you get a Human Artificer. That's a 3/2, and when Great Desert Prospector enters the battlefield, create a tap Power Stone token for each other creature you control. I'm not sure if this is standard playable, but if it does see standard play, I think where we're going to see it is in a dedicated artifact creature deck. So you cast some early low-cost artifact creatures, and then you use those after turn 5 to ramp into the 8-9 cost artifact creatures that we're seeing so far from the Brothers War. Next, we have Steel Seraph. For 6 mana. You get a artifact creature that's an angel. It has prototype. So for a colorless and 2 white, you can cast it for its prototype cost, and it's a 3/3 angel with flying. And if you cast it for 6 mana, it's a 5/4 angel with flying. And at the beginning of combat on your turn, choose Flying, Vigilance, or Lifelink. Target creature you control gains that ability until the end of turn. I think the mono white deck actually is probably going to want to play this as a couple of in its deck, because the ability to give something else Flying or Lifelink is really, really powerful in the current meta, because there aren't a lot of flying creatures around, and also that ability to gain some life is really important given the Sheoldras and other things that are chipping away at people's life throughout the course of a game. So this is definitely standard playable. I think is going to see standard play potentially in a couple kinds of decks. I can see a Boros deck having use for it, or obviously the mono white, but even the Esper deck might have a use for it as well. All right, next we have Union of the Third Path. For 2 colorless and a white mana, you get an instant that's draw a card, and then you gain life equal to the number of cards in your hand. I'm not sure if this is standard playable, but it's definitely going to be limited playable. White doesn't get much card draw on its own. That's not on a body. So this is nice little card draw at instant speed, and that life gain could be really critical in a matchup. Next, we have our blue offerings from the day. So first we got Take Flight. For 3 colors on a white mana, you get an enchantment that's an aura. Enchanted creature gets +1 and has flying, and whenever this creature attacks, draw a card. We've got this ability on other cards for less cost of gaining flying. Typically it's a 1 cost ability, or drawing a card and potentially discarding a card. That's usually a 1 cost ability. And we have Combat Research and some other ones that do this. So I don't really think that this is going to be standard playable. I mean, having the combination of things on the card is nice, but that 4 mana cost, I think, just makes it too much to see standard play. Next, we have Zephyr Sentinel. For a colorless and a blue mana, you get a human soldier. That's a 2/1. It has flash and flying. And when Zephyr Sentinel enters the battlefield, return up to 1 other target creature you control to its owner's hand. If it was a soldier, put a +1/+1 counter on Zephyr Sentinel. So one of the first things I want to point out here, you're not going to be forced to return Zephyr Sentinel to your hand if there's no other creatures on the battlefield. So if you cast this, there's no other creatures on the battlefield, nothing happens. So that's only if you've got something on the battlefield that could be sent back to your hand. But the ability to put a +1/+1 counter on it if you return a soldier, that's a nice little ability. So we've got some 1-drops that we've already talked about over the course of preview season that are nice. So I can see this, you play a 1-drop, maybe even block with it, and then flash this in, return that to your hand as a nice little bounce spell to prevent some damage, and then buff your Zephyr Sentinel to make it a 3/2. Last in blue we have Machine Over Matter, and this goes back to the early part of the Brothers War story after Urza and Mishra's had their falling out, and this is where Urza constructs a construct to lift a monolith to win Princess Kayla's hand in Krug. So it goes very much with the flavor of the set. So this spell costs 1 less to cast if you control an artifact creature. And for the 2 mana, you get to return non-land permanent to its owner's hands. Typically when we see this kind of card, it's a creature that you're returning to their hand. So the ability to potentially turn anything to your opponent's hand does have quite a bit of value. So if there's a pesky enchantment or a planeswalker you want to get, you can push that back to your opponent's hand and then they have to recast it. So I think there's potential play in Standard for this because of that non-land permanent ability on it, but we do have Fading Hope and some other things that do exactly the same thing for a guaranteed 1 cost. But again, if we get a dedicated artifact creature deck, this is a good card to go in that, assuming that it's in blue. Next, we have some black spells from the day. So first is Dream of Steel and Oil. For a black mana, you get a sorcery. Target creature reveals their hand. You choose an artifact or creature card from it. Then choose an artifact or creature card from their graveyard. Exile the chosen cards. This is a really good card. We've seen a card similar to this in Divest, but that only dealt with something in the hand. What Dreams of Steel and Oil does, not only looks at a person's hand, but also can pick something out of the graveyard. So Tenacious Underdog or something else that can come back to the battlefield is something it can pick off. And we've got cards with Blitz and Unearth that can come back from the graveyard as well. So I think this is very playable, and black decks are probably going to want to play it because most of the decks that are seeing successful play in Standard right now are mid-range decks, so you're almost guaranteed to pick off something with Dreams of Steel and Oil. Next, we have Gruesome Realization. For a colorless and 2 black mana, you get a sorcery where you get a choice. The choice is you get to draw 2 cards and lose 2 life, which is pretty much a typical cost for this kind of ability. Or creatures your opponent controls get -1/-1 until the end of turn. I can see situationally where you could use either ability. Right now, we're not seeing this ability play, but again, the flexibility of it gives it some Standard playability, particularly if you're playing against a token deck and you want to knock out all their 1/1 tokens. This is a great card for that. So certainly sideboard playable, but we do have other things that kind of do the same thing for 3 mana that aren't seeing a lot of play already. Next, we have probably the best black card of the day and one of the better cards of the day, period, which is Gixen Puppeteer. For 3 mana, colorless mana and a black, you get a Phyrexian Warlock that whenever you draw your second card each turn, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. When Phyrexian Puppeteer dies, return another target creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, and it's a 4/3. This is a lot on a body. Connive is a huge thing in the Esper deck, so I think this is going to be a card that is going to be a 2, maybe a 3 of in those decks, because you're almost guaranteed by the time you get to the mid game, you're going to have a Rafine out. You're going to be drawing at least 2 cards, if not more, every single turn. So this ability is going to activate where you're going to drain your opponent, you gain some life. And then again, if they kill Gixen Puppeteer, then you get to take a card that has 3 mana value or less, that's a creature, and put it on the battlefield in replace of it. So a very good card, possibly one of the best cards we've seen so far from the Brothers War set. Next, we have our only red card of the day, and that's Draconic Destiny. For a colorless and 2 red, you get an enchantment aura. It enchants creature. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has flying, haste, and pay 1 mana. This creature gets +1/+1 until the end of the turn, and it's a dragon in addition to its other types. When enchanted creature dies, return Draconic Destiny to its owner's hand. I think in a mid-range deck, this might have some value. Again, it's 3 mana, so it's a high cost, but the flexible abilities it gives a +1/+1, it gives flying, it gives haste, and you have the ability to pump extra mana into it to increase the damage that it's giving. So I think this has some playability in Standard. I'm just not sure what deck right now is going to want this. But again, that evasion that comes from flying is a desired ability, and I think because of the other things that go with it, it's definitely a playable card. And the fact that Draconic Destiny returns to your hand when the creature dies, that's a great thing because then you can just recast it and put it on something else. And I think that's really what makes it Standard playable. Next, we have our green offerings from the day. We've got 3. Alloy Animus for a green mana is a human druid. That's a 1/1. And for 2 colors and a green mana until the end of your turn, target non-creature artifact you control becomes a 4/4 artifact creature. So if we see a deck that has a lot of artifacts in it, and we can splash some green in for Alloy Animus, so those 1 cost and 2 cost Power Stones even can become a 4/4 for a turn. And I think that's a really great ability. So I think this is going to see play in a dedicated artifact deck in Standard, because that ability to just create a 4/4 for a turn is a really big ability for this particular card. Okay, Fauna Shaman is a elf shaman. It's our first elf actually from the set that we've seen. I'm actually surprised that it took this long for Wizards to get us one of the elves from Argoth. But for a colorless mana and a green, you get the elf shaman. That's a 2/2. And I think this is what makes it definitely Standard playable, and I think it's going to see quite a bit of Standard play because of this ability. Is for green mana, you can discard a creature card from your hand, search your library for a creature card, reveal it, put it in your hand, and then shuffle. That's an incredible ability. It's basically Demonic Tutor, but only for creatures. So even the cost of discarding a card, who cares? I can discard a 1 or a 2 drop, and I can go get my best creature from my deck. So I think this is definitely going to see play in a variety of green decks. So be on the lookout for it because you draw a creature card, maybe it's a duplicate of something you already have on the field that may be even something that's legendary. You discard it, you can go find a better card in your deck. All right, our last green card is Awaken the Woods. For X mana and 2 green, you get to create X 1/1 green forest dryad land creature tokens. It's a fine ability, but again, given the state of Standard, I don't see it really seeing much play unless we get a dedicated deck that wants forest dryads that are land creatures in it. And I just don't see one at this point forming. It'll be good limited. You cast this late in the game, you create 4, 5, 6 1/1 creature tokens. That'll help push you over the top. Potentially in that game, but for Standard playability, I'm just thinking it's not quite there. All right, we got 3 multicolored creatures as well today, and the first is Evangel of Synthesis. For a blue and a black mana, you get a Phyrexian Human Cleric. That's a 2/3. When Evangelist of Synthesis enters the battlefield, draw a card, then discard a card. So a typical blue ability on it. So some card filtering for you. And as long as you draw 2 or more cards this turn, Evangelist of Synthesis gets +1 and has Menace. So if you're in a deck that's going to draw you multiple cards per turn, this becomes a 3/3 with Menace all the time. So that's a pretty good ability on it. Now, is there a Standard deck that wants that? Well, one of the things we keep seeing over and over in the cards today and in recent days is this the desire to draw a second card on a turn, and that gives you some bonus. So in a deck that's kind of dedicated to that bonus feature, I think we might have some playability for this. But it's going to be in a really specific kind of deck that's going to want it. It's not going to see broad standard play. All right, next we have Junkyard Genius. For a colorless, a black, and a red mana, you get a Human Artificer that's a 2/2. When Junkyard Genius enters the battlefield, you create a tapped Power Stone token. Okay, so you're creating that. So for the 3 mana, you're getting a Power Stone and a 2/2 creature. Not a bad rate for this. And then for a colorless, a black, and a red, you can sacrifice another creature or artifact until end of turn. Other creatures you control get +1 and gain menace and haste. I can see this, the Oni Cult Anvil decks. This is a card I think that goes into those decks. I'm not sure it's a 4 of, but it probably at least a 2 of, because what you do with this is you pay the money, sacrifice one of the constructs that you have. It replaces itself because of the anvil on your turn, and then you're giving that creature and every other creature that you've got +1 and menace and haste. And I think that combination of abilities can help snowball you to a victory, because in a lot of situations it's that number of creatures on each side are about equal, and when you get menace, that means now each of your guys is equivalent of 2, and that can be enough to push damage enough to go ahead and win a game. Lastly, we have Deathbloom Ritualist. For 3 colorless, a black, and a green, you get an Elf Warlock that's a 3/5. So stats wise, not the best, but you get to add X mana of any one color, where X is the number of creature cards in your graveyard. So in a dedicated mill deck, self-mill deck, this might be a really good card because it'll allow you to access a lot of mana on a given turn just by having creature cards in your graveyard. And I think with all the unearth abilities and blitz abilities that are out there, and our reanimation spells that we have, I think this is a really good card in that style of deck. So we do see that in Standard right now with the Titan of Industry deck. So I think this is a card that might fit really well into that deck for getting that extra mana to pump into things to get more value out of the things you're milling into your graveyard. All right, lastly, we've got some artifact creatures to look at. The first is Persistent Behemoth. For 5 mana, you get an artifact creature that's a beast. It's a 2/7, so stat-wise, not really impressive, but it has a really important ability. You may play lands from your graveyard. We just talked about the elf that is going to give you the ability to create extra mana based on the number of creatures in your graveyard. This is a creature in that kind of self-mill deck that now you can just pull out your lands from that are milled and put them onto the battlefield. So I think that's a pretty powerful ability in a vacuum, and looking at it that way. And that deck may very much like it, because then if I'm milling lands, I can put them back into play if I don't have a land in my hand I want to play, or if I don't want to play a land out of my hand, I can play one out of my graveyard and hopefully hit my land drop every turn. So that way, if I draw a Titan of Industry, I don't have to worry about milling it or discarding it. I can just play it on turn 7 for that value. And you can also unearth it for 2 green mana to get that ability back. The unearth I'm not really excited about, but that land ability is a pretty good one. Next we have Yodian Frontliner. For 1 mana, you get an artifact creature that's a soldier, ends a 1/1. This is another 1-drop soldier, so we're starting to see a few more of those. So I think we're going to get to the point where we've got a critical mass of 1-drop soldiers that are going to push that soldier deck to a point where it's very, very playable. And whenever Yodian Frontliner attacks, another target creature you control gets +1/+1 until the end of turn. And you can unearth it for a white mana. And our last card of the day, which I think is our best card of the day, is Platoon Dispenser. For 5 mana, you get an artifact creature that's a construct. It's a 4/6, so it's got good solid stats. And at the beginning of your end step, if you control 2 or more other creatures, you get to draw a card. I can't see a world in Standard where if you've got this on the field based on the fact that it's dominated by mid-range decks right now, that this is not a card draw engine. So we've talked a lot today about creatures that have abilities that want you to draw a second card in a turn. This is a great card for that. And I can see this being played in a wide variety of decks because it's colorless. It can play in any deck you want to. So any deck that is playing creatures that wants extra card draw, this is a good card for that. And you can also, it has the ability for 4 mana, 3 colors, and a white to create a 1/1 colorless soldier artifact creature token. So if you don't have that, you can create one, draw the card. So you're pretty much guaranteed because of its own abilities to get a extra card draw every single turn, which is really powerful. And then you can also unearth it for 2 colorless and 2 white mana. All right, that's the cards for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Tell us what you think about the cards that we saw today and what you think. Am I missing something? Did I hit on some things? Let us know in the comments. And again, special thanks to Caffeinated Gamer for sponsoring our video. Please remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already. And thanks for staying to the end. And we'll be back tomorrow with day 7 of the Brothers War spoilers. I'll see you then.